Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
All right, well, welcome to the AC Podcast, we're doing a crossover episode this time around.
I'm excited.
I have my special guest here, AJ Thomas, who I have in the flesh. We are on the set of your podcast, which is the Back Corner Podcast, which I have frequented.
Yeah, that we just recorded your 4th episode.
Yeah.
And so if you...
The most frequent guest.
If you like Ben, check out the Back Corner Podcast. Me and my lead pastor, Brent Ingersoll.
That's right.
And it's like 2 hours, and it's everything from foolishness to deep theology. It's a good time. It's a good hang.
It's a good hang. It's a little bit more fun, isn't it? It's a little bit more loosey-goosey, so to speak.
Yeah, it's pretty...
2 hours of rambling and theology. This is the AC Pie, so pay no attention to the Back Corner. This is now the Apologetics Canada Podcast, which AJ Thomas, my guest, has been kind enough, gracious enough to offer me some of his time, because this is the next episode in a series that we're doing called Denominations in Conversation. And you are a Wesleyan, die-in-the-wool, generations of Wesleyan pastors. Am I right about that? Your father's father?
One generation.
Okay, just one.
Yeah, my dad was the first one, but yeah. But I mean, I grew up in a Wesleyan parsonage on the campus of a Wesleyan Bible college. I'm an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church and have been for 25 years. Yep. So I'm fairly in.
There you go. And full disclosure, we are currently in St. John's, New Brunswick, or Quispamsis. Quispamsis, to be a little
Quispamsis.
Quispamsis. Okay,
Sis.
yeah. Which means what?
I don't know.
Okay.
But the town slogan is, there is no other, which is one of those, no one else was dumb enough to name their town Quispamsis. I assume it's an indigenous word for something.
Well, I figured it would be. So, but full disclosure, AJ and I go way back. I pastored at the Wesleyan Church that you founded back when? When did you Deepwater Wesleyan Church?
Deepwater, we launched in 2007.
In 2007, and in a movie theater on Park Lane in Park Lane Road or Park Lane Mall.
Park Lane Mall and Spring Garden Road, right downtown Halifax. Yep.
And I should also say, very formative for my own journey. As I tell people, I was raised in the Anglican Church. Father's an Anglican priest. I was baptized and confirmed there. But in my early 20s, I had a lot of difficulty with answering certain questions that were being hurled at me by the new atheist movement and friends who were questioning this stuff. And I realized, I had a lot of questions, and I kind of walked away from I would never have said I was an atheist per se, but I was deeply troubled and wrestling with some things. And my wife and I, Melissa, who was my girlfriend at the time, met in journalism school in Halifax, really wanted to find a place to get back into the church, and we found Deepwater, and we found you guys, and
we were glad you did.
And it absolutely changed everything. I mean, not just my relationship with Jesus, but that journey of following Jesus, where He's going to take me, and that led me to theological study and stuff. It was through small groups at Deepwater Church, and so I just want to say all of that to say the Wesleyan Church has had a profound impact on my life, and so I'm really interested in diving into this from the denominational standpoint and getting into it. So What I typically like to ask guests, the first thing is always, how do we define the church? And if maybe I could just say it this way, if somebody is unfamiliar with the Wesleyan tradition, in 60 seconds, what would you say is the defining characteristic of the Wesleyan denomination? Yeah,
so we would be kind of in the Holiness and Methodist traditions.
You want to separate that? So, because I want to cover Wesleyanism and Methodism.
Yeah,
this will be together in this episode, but there is a distinction.
Sure. So more of a distinction of origin than theology.
Okay.
So there's the American Holiness Movement. So think tent meeting revivals. The beating a sawdust trail, very revivalist, very low church.
Right.
And large emphasis on this beautiful poorly named doctrine called entire sanctification, which is a Wesley thing. Yes. And so you've got that sort of side of our family. The Wesleyan Church is made up of a merger of a bunch of different denominations, but the two chief ones were a group called the Pilgrim Holiness, which were from that more American Holiness Movement. I mean, that's a thing. You can Google it if you want to do a deep dive. American Holiness Movement. And then on the other side, you had the Methodist Church as it launched in North America. Circuit riding preachers going out to the frontiers. People are getting saved. They tell them to go to church because the Methodism was a renewal movement within Anglicanism, right?
Right.
And there were no churches in these frontier towns. Long story short, the Anglicans wouldn't launch them. Wouldn't launch new churches for these new converts. And so eventually Wesley broke down and had some of his lay preachers ordained, which he didn't have he wasn't a bishop. He didn't have the authority to do that, which is what created the break, which founded the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was basically his way of going, I'm not trying to be a separate thing, but to be clear, we are the Methodist off-brand of the Episcopal Church. And that became the largest denomination in North America for many years. You jump ahead to the abolition of slavery movement. There was a split within Methodism over those who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery, or those who were on the pro-slavery side would say over those who didn't feel the church should get involved in political matters, and the abolitionists. The abolitionist group that broke away became what was called the Wesleyan Methodist Connection, which then became the Wesleyan Methodist Church, which is what merged with the Pilgrim Holiness in 1966 to form the Wesleyan Church. So a bunch of Methodist abolitionists who believed in the work of God to transform the human heart, to empower us to live the kind of life he's called us to. Yeah. A bunch of American Holiness Movement types who believed in the transforming power of God's grace to change the human heart and empower us to live the kind of life he's called us to live, who eventually merged and formed this new thing called the Wesleyan Church.
Right. Okay, well, so there's a few things we'll have to get into. So we'll have to remind me to come back to entire sanctification, because this is a core doctrine there.
That would be our pet doctrine.
But let's go back to John Wesley himself.
Yeah.
The brother of Charles Wesley, not to be relegated. I mean, Charles Wesley, pretty big deal himself in terms of his hymn writing and all of this.
Absolutely.
But let's go back to John Wesley is an Anglican. Really, the Anglicans love to remind the Wesleyans, right? I was an Anglican till the day he died. Right?
I have a friend who grew up Wesleyan who converted to Anglicanism, and he always says, I love John Wesley so much, I joined his church. Yeah, exactly. Backhanded way of saying, great job, John. Yeah. But there is a sense in which you're talking about this sort of, he breaks down, like it was initially the movement of Wesley out into field preaching is a reluctant move, is it not? Yeah, well, so Wesley had a real passion for sharing the gospel and calling people to follow Jesus, and didn't find a lot of home for that within the Anglican tradition. And because of, I think, the aggressiveness of his preaching and calling people to live a holy life, Wesley was by nature very high church.
Yes, right.
He did not like not preaching in church, but the thing he liked less was not preaching. So he would, the move to field preaching, as I understand it, was often caused not by some brilliant strategy, but by him being expelled. Like he would go preach in an Anglican church and they're like, you can't preach here.
Yeah, because you're breaking the rules.
There's this one classic story where he preached in the church and they told him he needed to leave. So he went out and preached on the front steps of the church. And then they told him he had to leave town. So he left town. And then they told him he couldn't preach on the road out there or whatever. So eventually this was in his home area. He went and stood on his own father's gravestone.
Oh my.
In a graveyard. Because you can't kick a guy off his own dad's tombstone.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
And preach from there. But I mean, even more so than that, like the Methodism in the great tradition of terms like Christianity or Christian started out as an insult. And so Wesley, when he was at Oxford, him and some other guys got together and formed this thing they called the Holy Club. And they were
quite the title.
Yeah, it's if you understand it as that's what they were pursuing, it doesn't sound quite as pretentious, but exactly. We are the club of the holy.
Holy club.
But and kind of sharing life on life. Really, Wesley, I think, was a pioneer in what becomes kind of the small group movement.
Yeah.
And so they developed this method of discipleship, and it's based on 3 different kind of meetings. One is called the society meeting. So that's it would look a lot like your classic evangelical worship service. Right. They're not celebrating sacraments. It's not meant to replace church involvement. Like I say, it's a renewal movement. It would have more in common with Alpha than it would with starting a new denomination. I mean, it was an evangelistic tool, but in a very different cultural context. Everyone was a Christian, just some of them weren't Christians. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. But so what ends up happening is they have these, let's say Wednesday night. I don't think it was, had to be Wednesday, but a meeting where they'd be singing and preaching. We're going to sing Charles's hymns, and we're going to preach Wesley's theology, John Wesley's theology. So there's the society meeting. Then they had something called a class, which was a smaller group, say 12 or so people, and they would get together once a week at least and inquire, how doth thy soul prosper? Just kind of like, how's it going with you and Jesus? How's your pursuit of him? How's your, how are you kind of growing? What's he teaching you? How are you growing in faith? That kind of a thing. Right. So kind of a sharing community kind of focused thing. And then they had an even smaller group, which was usually 3 to 5. It was called a band. And it was always married guys with married guys, single guys with single guys, married gals with married gals. So it was very segmented in that sense. And it was just really intense accountability. Yeah,
it was high accountability.
Yeah, so
hence a holiness movement.
So first question, there's a bunch of questions they asked when you joined, and then 5 questions they were supposed to ask each other every meeting. I won't remember them all, but I know the first one was just, how have you sinned since our last meeting? Yeah. So it just immediately starts with a discipline of confession. How have you been tempted, but I forget what the exact language was, but but resisted? Like, where have you been tempted? You didn't sin, but it's a temptation you faced. Yeah. Which I think is, like, there's a genius in that question of bringing that area of temptation to the light before it even becomes a sin. Yeah. Right. And so, like, next week, if you're going to come back and go, that thing I told you I'd been tempted by last week? Yeah, I totally caved this week. Like, I think there's a beauty in that, like, just being open about those struggles. So yeah, how have you been tempted? Is there anything you've done that you're not sure if it was a sin or not? The idea being, we'll let you know.
We'll let you know.
Like, if you're wondering if you crossed a line, your brothers or your sisters here, we're going to help you discern that. And then I'm trying to remember what the 4th question was. I don't remember, but the last question was basically like, have you lied to us? Oh, okay. Like, or what, is there anything that you have not, that you have left unsaid or something like that? But it was just kind of that gut check of like, if you're hiding anything, if you're now's the time to come out with it.
So would you say, one of my experiences within the Wesleyan church, and especially, our church, was we had Celebrate Recovery. And Celebrate Recovery, which is a program many people might be familiar with, which helps addicts. And it feels like that in many ways was a backbone to our DNA as a church. And do you think that's sort of embedded into not just the way our particular church functioned, but in Wesleyanism in general, you kind of get a sense like it's rooted in bringing those people into communion? I mean,
it's certainly very much a part of the Wesleyan tradition to work with those.
Those people being, in a sense, all of us, but also
but like people who are down and out, people who are on the margins, and addicts specifically. That's one of the reasons historically Wesleyans are teetotalers. Why we use grape juice instead of wine for communion. We don't need anybody falling off the wagon while we're doing communion. I will say, shout out to all my CR friends out there. CR is it's a Christ-centered 12-step program that helps people with life's hurts, habits, and hang-ups. So addictions are certainly in the mix there, but there's lots of other wonderful mental health issues, codependency issues, trauma, all that kind of stuff. It can be really helpful for, but it is kind of based on that 12-step model. Right. I would say, so one of the interesting things within the Wesleyan Church is that although we take our name from Wesley and we trace our heritage back to him on the Wesleyan Methodist side, a lot of how we actually do church generally is much more influenced by that revivalist tradition of the Pilgrim holiness and the American Holiness Movement side. And so I think there's actually a lot of strength in the method of Methodism that we, broadly speaking, haven't always held well to. And we've held on to some of the doctrines, but not the actual discipleship frameworks that help to reinforce those.
Right.
And so we could get off on a whole tangent about, we'll maybe talk about this a little bit when we get to entire sanctification. There's a whole kind of breadth of how people view that. But to your question, I would say that Celebrate Recovery, there is a lot of how that program operates that echoes the Methodist method. Like you come together in a large group for worship and teaching.
And confess your sins.
Right. There's a smaller group where you just kind of share how your week's been going and that kind of stuff, support each other. And then that's the open share group. And then an even smaller group called a step study where you really get into the nitty gritty of it and talk. You do your, again, this is a 12-step thing, but you do your moral inventory. You make your amends. You're dealing with that stuff. You're really open about your stuff. And I do think that, in fact, I actually at Deepwater once came in and shared with our CR leaders, walked them through how CR parallels that Methodist method of discipleship, and just going this is not, CR isn't just super effective because some guy 20 years ago came up with it. There's hundreds of years of kind of track record of effective discipleship in this kind of approach.
So then let's go right into entire sanctification, or otherwise known as Christian perfectionism.
Yeah.
The idea, essentially, my understanding is that you are progressing in the Holiness Movement to a place where you will never knowingly sin. You will never, that essentially it's possible, so says Wesley, to get to a place in life where I am no longer led by the desires of the flesh. I am now living in the Spirit enough that I am not consciously, at least, sinning actively.
So let's talk about that a little bit. There's a spectrum of belief on that within the Wesleyan Church. And as with most things, most Wesleyans are on the opposite end of Wesley on that, on that spectrum.
Sure.
But so I think the first thing you got to understand, and this is the thing that trips people up when you talk about this doctrine, is how Wesley defines sin. Okay. So Wesley had two kinds of sin that he would talk about. One would be what he would call sins of infirmity. So these are the sins that are just kind of inherent in the human condition. So sometimes you're a little grumpy and you maybe snap at somebody. Sometimes you, whatever.
Guilty.
Yeah. You stub your toe and say something less than edifying, you whatever else, right?
Sure.
So you just don't realize that someone is sensitive about something and you say something and you hurt them, and that's wrong and you should apologize and all that kind of stuff. But he would call those sins of infirmity. Just they flow out of our human limitations. And then he would talk about sin properly so called, which he defined as a willful transgression of a known law of God.
Right.
So it's a sin that is a conscious act of rebellion. I know it's wrong before I do it, and I make a choice to do it. And so when he talks about whether you'd call it victory over sin, or some sense of freedom from sin, that's the category he's talking about. It's not some sort of sinless perfection where you never make mistakes, you never whatever, but it's this idea of the question is, can the grace of God and the work of the Holy Spirit bring you to a place where you no longer where rebellion against God is no longer the norm for you.
Right.
So when some other traditions would talk about sinning every day in thought, word, and deed.
Yes.
Well, if you're defining sin as a willful transgression of a known law of God,
right.
is there a place of growth in grace where a willful transgression of a known law of God is not something you do every day in thought, word, and deed?
Well, and that confession is typically in thought, word, and deed by what we have done and by what we have left undone, right? And so obviously,
So there's kind of that, that's kind of the framework you need to understand. And so whenever we talk about, say, victory over sin, that kind of a thing, we're not talking about flawlessness. We're talking about the end of a rebellion.
It's not denying the sort of Lutheran idea of simile justus et peccator, like simultaneously justified and sinner. That's still very much a part of.
Yes,
He's still,
and it's a by God's grace thing.
Yeah.
The most popular terms for this doctrine are entire sanctification, which is a dumb term.
Why don't you like the term? Just because?
Well, it implies a finished point.
Yeah, right.
And I think that a more healthy understanding of that doctrine is more of a watershed than a finish line.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea would be, when we come to faith in Christ, we are sanctified in the sense that we're set apart for Him.
Right.
And we are positionally holy. We have, we are separated to God and we're forgiven of our sin. But that there's this change and transformation that happens in our character, right?
Right.
Is it imputed righteousness, then imparted righteousness, right? That we're not just, hopefully, if you've been following Jesus for 20 years, hopefully you're not the exact same miserable wretch you were the day He found you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, hopefully there's been some growth in grace, growth in holiness.
Working out your salvation in fear and trembling.
Refinement of your character, becoming more Christ-like.
Yeah.
And I think pretty much every tradition believes in some idea of sanctification.
It can get left on the doorstep sometimes in certain traditions, I think, and that comes with a certain understanding of sola fide and like I am saved on the moment of conversion. I am declared righteous before the throne of God. And that of course doesn't mean that the work's done.
Yes.
Right? Well, and this is, we now carry on this.
And so, that's another kind of language that frames this as works of grace, right? So Wesleyans, and I don't mean just the Wesleyan church, but people in that Wesleyan Methodist kind of traditional camp tend to talk about three works of grace: justification, sanctification, and glorification.
Right.
And so justification is what happens when you're saved. Sanctification is this generally understood to most commonly be a later point. Right. I don't think it's not categorically necessary that it is, but just that's how it usually works out. And then glorification is what happens when you die and God zaps you, and then you really are
God zaps you.
really are perfect. But so the idea being that there's this point of growth you can get to. Wesley's favorite term, which I don't know why, if it was his favorite term, he didn't use it more often, was not entire sanctification or Christian perfection, but perfect love. And again, by perfect, we're talking in the older sense of complete and mature, not flawless.
Okay. Yeah.
But this idea that if God has commanded you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, it makes sense that by His grace, He would empower you to do that. Right? That God doesn't command things that we are incapable of, and then judge us for that incapacity, right?
Yeah. You're actually able.
Yeah. That what He commands, He empowers, right?
Yeah,
what He commands, He enables. Not necessarily instantly, not necessarily overnight, but
possible.
Yeah. And so Wesley tended to believe that this was a thing to strive towards, and I believe he even would say that it was something that it was a thing that was possible, not necessarily a thing that was guaranteed or easy in this life.
Yeah.
And so, there might be people who are growing towards that. And that was part of the reason he had this whole method, right? Because it wasn't just that you get zapped and then that's how you are.
There were pretty strict parameters around how
you're growing towards that. Possible. You're aggressively, methodically growing towards that. Then you get in the American Holiness Movement, specifically, there's a lady by the name of Phoebe Palmer, who comes out with what she calls the shorter way, which I think should always raise a red flag, frankly, when someone's talking about the shorter way to be holy.
Right.
And it was called altar theology, the idea being that the altar sanctifies the gift. So that when, in the Old Testament, what made sheep holy is that you put it on the altar. And so she somehow, in her mind, you'll subtly pick up that I'm not a big Phoebe Palmer fan. She somehow in her mind got this notion that basically you would come to an altar in the sense of like a bench where you pray in in these revivalist meetings, and you would give it all over to God, and He would zap you, and from there forward, temptation wouldn't really have much power over you anymore, and you would kind of quite instantly move into something adjacent to sainthood.
Right.
And I've always, that was a common belief. That's the version of it that I grew up around. It wasn't it's not codified in our doctrine. There's wiggle room in there, but I think that the challenge with it is if I were in a place where I could truly give everything to God, I'm already sanctified, right? My will is the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And so if I can if you fully surrender your will to God, then, you become more like Christ. I was like, no, I think once you fully surrender, that's the end line, not the start. Like that is the graduation, right?
Yeah.
If my will is completely, fully, permanently submitted to the Lord, I don't know how much more holy than that you can get.
Yeah, right.
The issue is always when there's a conflict between my will and his, and I pick mine, right?
Yeah.
And so one of my favorite succinct definitions of what Wesleyan theology is Wesleyans are people who are optimistic about the possibilities of grace.
I love it.
Like what grace can actually, what God's grace can accomplish in
how
someone.
How transformative it can actually be.
In this life, what is possible. And so I would tend to be very much a John Wesleyan on the question of entire sanctification, far less a Phoebe Palmerin.
Sure.
But that is the kind of the range that exists.
Well, and I'm right with you on that. I mean, so one of the things that I studied intensely in my doctoral studies is actually like the history of atheism and the rise of secularism and all of this stuff. And it's funny to me that the apologists around the 17th, 18th century, when certain scientific understandings of the world, and you were dealing with a new kind of sort of atheism, so to speak. One of the rebuttals that is repeated by the apologists has less to do with like where we do apologetics today on like, historicity of the resurrection or something like that. It had more to do with the sanctification of the reprobate. Like the fact that you were taking these destitute, maybe, people who are down and out, but who are the reprobates. Yeah. Their lives are transformed by the power of the gospel.
Yes.
And that this became a sort of proof of that's the power of the gospel. That's the only proof we need is look at this individual who's hardly recognizable anymore because of the sanctifying grace that he's experienced.
Yeah. I think still today, like
he or she.
That whole idea of a man with a testimony is never at the mercy of a man with a theory.
Oh,
like
I like that.
It's one of those. I think our culture today cares less about compelling arguments and a lot more about does it work?
Does it work? Yeah.
Like I'm depressed. Can this help with that?
Yeah.
And if it does, I don't care if I understand exactly how or if someone else can make a more I have not been able to get off this substance I've been abusing for 20 years.
Yeah.
Can this do that? Because if it can, I'm in. Right. As opposed to, well, where did, Cain get his wife?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what I'm really, people have much more immediate.
So talk to me about that for a second, because I think sometimes Wesleyanism can also be seen as defend the fact that it's not a legalism, because holy movement means there's a high degree of accountability. Yeah. So something, for instance, like in the Wesleyan tradition, like you said, teetotalers, no alcohol. And largely this comes out of the scripture that says, if something causes my brother to stumble, then I refrain from it. Yep. So I'm free in all things, but not all things are beneficial. This becomes, from the Wesleyan standpoint, I think other people on the outside characterize, I keep tripping over that word, but turn it into a caricature to say, well, that's just a legalism and you don't need to, but how would you see that from the Wesleyan side?
Well, I would say every theological tradition has its besetting sins.
Yes. Yeah. The thing they risk.
Yep. Right. The thing, and the thing that they calcify into if they don't fight against it.
Right.
And so, I've got some relatives, people connected to my family, who were raised in a version of Calvinism where once saved, always saved. So you can just live like the devil because you prayed that prayer. And no actual thinking Calvinist thinks that the perseverance of the saints is designed to allow you to shoot up a prayer in grade 4 and then live like the devil the rest of your life. Right. But you can see how you get there.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so I would say, first of all, within the holiness tradition, legalism is our besetting sin.
Sure.
It is the thing that we drift into really easily. Yeah. And a lot of times it is because we forget the origin of the standard and instead just make the standard the point. So if you're going into frontier towns with hard working, hard drinking men who drink up the whole paycheck and their kids are going hungry and they're fighting in the streets, you don't want to support that. You don't want to send a mixed message about that. You don't want, like, if you're surrounded by people who can't drink in moderation, then you just not drinking is the right thing to do.
Right.
If you're surrounded with, you mentioned celebrate recovery. Know, I've often, as a Wesleyan pastor, you aren't allowed to drink alcohol. But I've often said I wouldn't, for a lot of reasons. One, I think I'd become an alcoholic. But one of the reasons I wouldn't is that there's so many people that I work with who I know struggle with that.
Yeah.
I don't want either, if we get together, them worried if I'm going to be drinking in front of them. And I don't want, even in a moment of their weakness, for them to know that every now and again AJ has a beer, and for the enemy to be able to get in their head and go, well, if you're a pastor, you could have one too. AJ just has one, you have one, right?
Well, I remember when I was a stand-in youth pastor for you for a brief period of time, that was the thing we talked about. I mean, we ministered to a lot of inner city youth and stuff like that. And I remember you said it to me, you just went like, they don't know the difference between you and their Uncle Billy who drinks a case of Budweiser's on the weekend. Like, you're setting that example. So in that sense, it's not. So
I think if you legal. Hold on to that, this is motivated out of what will best help me follow Christ personally, and what will best serve those around me. That's a beautiful option. I don't think I don't think teetotaling is gospel.
Sure.
But I think it's a wise way to live your life. I don't judge people who.
No, it's backed by the science. Yeah.
Well, and that is, it's interesting. I've been in this long enough, because it's always a subject of debate in our denomination. There was a season where the science was, actually, like a little red wine's good for heart health, and now you come to the other end, and the seems like the current consensus is, no, it's poison.
Yeah, exactly. Andrew Huberman might be a Wesleyan, yes.
Yeah. So I would say, and that's true with all kinds of standards, that they can calcify. They cease to be things we do to help us be more like Jesus and to love our neighbor well. And they become things that we do to prove our holiness to other people. Right. And then to judge other people based on their compliance with. And so, there was a time where Wesleyans didn't go to the movies.
Yeah.
I was just, you didn't know. You'd never darken those doors because unholy things happen there. That's not untrue.
Yeah. Maybe at a certain age and a certain time, that might be the move to make.
Totally. Yeah. And there was a time when, early on where, there wasn't movie ratings yet, and you really never did know what you were walking, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. And so, there probably was a time when that was a better practice. We would see that, they would have seen that in a similar way we might see today, having some filters on your internet.
Yeah.
Right. Like use some of those screen time filters, there's garbage there you don't need to be exposed to. But then it became, somebody wouldn't take their kid to a matinee of a Disney movie because someone's going to see me coming out of there and they're going to think I was in there watching some horrible X-rated and you're just like, no one's actually going to think. But it sort of becomes a way to measure our holiness against each other instead of measure our holiness against Christ.
Right.
And rather than being a way to love other people, it becomes a way to prove ourselves to other people. And so, I think I'm all for high moral standards. Yeah. I'm all for strong convictions. But I do think that if that's your deal, you really do need to be aware how easily that ossifies into legalism, and into self-righteousness. Yeah. And
therefore creating a method in which you can abstain from this and move away from it and set up actually some healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
You had talked about, I'm interested to know how much this sort of plays into your thinking of the theology. You talked about the will and our free will and our
Yeah.
human will. And this often becomes another point of Wesleyanism, is that it seems like a break with the Calvinists. Like in terms of, I always remind people, when you talk about Arminianism and Calvinism, like it's important to recognize that Arminius was a Calvinist.
Yeah.
Right. And that the Synod of Dort and all of that is couched within that tradition, not something outside of it or something. But that there is an emphasis here. It seems like the Arminian side of the debate won out in the Wesleyan church.
I mean, if you were to describe, like, if you were to ask me theologically what Wesleyans are, I would say the term we use is Wesleyan Arminian.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like it's baked into it. And so how does that help play itself out, or where do you see the distinctive of like the idea of free will in the Wesleyan tradition? Yeah. Where's its point of emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, we would. I think there's this false dichotomy, this caricature, to use your word earlier, that people paint between Calvinists and Arminians, that one believes in the sovereignty of God and the other believes in free will.
Right.
And I don't know that that's accurate.
Yeah.
I think it's more, we both believe in God's sovereignty for sure. Mm-hmm. And I think Calvinists still believe in some sense of free will.
Yeah, sure.
At least that you're morally culpable for your choices, like enough free will for that, right? I remember hearing Tim Keller, who would be my favorite Calvinist, which
not a bad one to.
No, it's not a long list for me either. But yeah, like just kind of talking about how, like, if we could see things, I think something to the effect, I think like kind of we could see things from God's perspective, or even like earlier Christians' perspective, they didn't see those things as being in tension as much as we do.
Yeah.
But I would say, Wesleyans would tend to see the way God exercises his sovereignty is by giving us free will.
Right.
If God can't give you free will, it's not because he's sovereign. Clearly that would be he's not sovereign, because there's a thing he can't do. Right. So it's not, I don't think our free will impinges on God's sovereignty. It does impinge on God's micromanagement. Yeah. But that's a different thing. And so, we would tend to emphasize free will. That said, so we wouldn't believe in individualistic predestination. God's got a set list from before the foundation of the earth by name, who's in, who's out, who could be saved, who's not going to be. We'd be much more in the whosoever will may come, right? That whosoever believes, that kind of thing. But that's not the same thing as believing that people can just wake up one day and decide to give their life to Jesus, decide to repent. So we believe in something called prevenient grace.
Yeah, I was going to.
The grace that goes before, I assume from the same root as prevent, but I'd have never done the homework. But yeah, it's that idea that no one can come to the Father unless they're called. Yeah. We would tend to believe that God in his grace gives everybody that shot at some point in their life.
I've understood prevenient grace sometimes with the metaphor of, Wesley talked about, like, there's a burning ember within each, that the fanning of the flame, but there's something already, the spark of God's morality within us that needs to be sparked, needs to be, I mean, does that kind of comport with what you're saying?
I mean, it doesn't clash with it. I've never heard that one before, but I would tend to think of it more, Scripture says God is not willing that any should perish. Mm-hmm. And so if God is not willing that any should perish, and yet we are, I'm not a huge fan of the term totally depraved, but because some people help an old lady across the street just to be nice and they don't know Jesus. And I think that's still good. But I would say we are terminally depraved. Like we are depraved beyond, like we can't save ourselves. Yeah. So if God doesn't want anyone to perish and we can't do anything to save ourselves, and that requires God giving us the grace to respond to the gospel. Right. Like we choose the response, but it's empowered by him, pre-empowered by him, right? Like he sends the invitation, we receive it. So if God doesn't want any to perish, but will perish without his intervention in that way, then it only makes sense that he intervenes in that way, but that it doesn't say God will not permit that any should perish. Right. So that doesn't mean it's not universalism. Sure. But it's one of those, like, how'd you nail this down? I don't know, but I think, everybody somewhere in their time on this earth, there's a moment where God is calling to them, and they are empowered to respond in faith. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this segues nicely to another major point of emphasis, I think, with Wesley, which is the proclamation of the word.
Yeah.
I know many pastors. Pastors can hold different kinds of roles in terms of there being a shepherd figure or somebody who's a bit of an apostle type. And you, above all people I know, are a preacher. Like, you are a preacher of the word. You should hear this guy preach. I remember watching you at the 7 Last Words thing that
was
Emmanuel
so fun,
Baptist
bro.
did, and man,
So
you brought the
fun.
house down. Wesley preached, man. Like you were talking about, he tried to preach in the church. They moved him.
Yeah.
He preached on the steps. He keeps preaching. Like, talk a little bit about, first of all, Wesley as a preacher. Didn't he preached some obscene number of sermons?
Yeah, he just nonstop preaching.
And then the role of the preaching of the word in Wesleyan theology.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know that we have a really clearly articulated theology of preaching, but one of the things Wesley's referred to as a folk theologian, meaning like he never wrote a systematic theology or anything like that. His theology becomes evident by watching what he preached would be a big part of it. He did write some books, but a lot of his theology, like if you're going to write a book on Wesleyan theology, you're not sitting down with his version of dogmatics or institutes or whatever. You're sitting down with his 52 standard sermons. You're sitting down with his journals. You're sitting down with this little thin book he wrote about entire sanctification. Like we're talking 80 pages or whatever, and you're piecing it all together. And so a lot of Wesleyan theology is, to borrow a phrase, more caught than taught. And so certainly the way he did ministry hugely emphasized the preaching of the word. And the fact that, one of his big investment in people projects beyond the kind of broad discipleship that he was doing through Methodism in general was raising up lay preachers, circuit riding preachers. And these guys, I'm trying to remember what the specifics. I feel like the average age those guys died, I want to say, was early 30s.
Wow.
Just because of how hard, like it was just constant. You would just ride and preach, get on and ride to the next town. It was a brutal life. And so if he felt like it was worth literally spending the lives of people, obviously he had a very high view of preaching. And I would say that extends in our tradition in ways that I think are beautiful. Like there's a high emphasis on the preaching of the word, on the transformative power of the word proclaimed. Our default is to preach about it. Like we got an issue. Well, how do we preach about it? Like, let's preach about it. I would say, I think that in ways that are like that emphasis, I think is beautiful. I do think that in ways that are maybe less healthy and less theologically astute, a lot of times in the Wesleyan tradition, and this more would come out of our Holiness Movement side, preaching functions as the sacrament.
Interesting.
And so therefore, the key moment in someone's conversion is not their baptism, but when they came to the altar call at the end of the sermon.
Okay.
And the high point of worship is not the reception, the celebration of the Lord's Supper, but it is the preaching of the word.
Right.
Which is why, at Deepwater, it's not normal for Wesleyan churches to do communion every week like we do at Deepwater, did at Deepwater.
Yeah, you did. I noticed that as I would move around different Wesleyan churches. We did it every week, but not all of them.
The typical, I think we're required officially, although I don't think anyone checks, to do it quarterly.
Oh, interesting.
That's the requirement.
Okay.
And I would say in most churches, you wouldn't find it any more often than weekly or any more often than monthly. There are, the last time I looked into it, which has been a while, there were maybe 5 or 6 churches I could find worldwide in the Wesleyan church that did communion weekly. And that was not, that's not a downplay of preaching, but I place a high value on the sacraments. So I would say, the upside of that emphasis is you at least have the opportunity to really teach, to educate, to develop the theological understanding of people in your congregation. And I do think there is this beautiful thing, maybe even more so today than ever, that the simplicity, as Paul talks about the foolishness of preaching, like a guy's just going to stand up and talk.
Yeah, right.
Like that's a countercultural act now. And that there are still people, I run into them all the time, who would go like, the moment it clicked for me, or that pivotal transition where it finally like came to faith, or realized, that I believed in Jesus or whatever else, like that's not some incredible movie or some multimedia presentation or something.
Right.
That was a transformative moment for people. Like I do think there's a beauty in that. But I do think there've been,
it's the very thing that happened to John Wesley. Right, I mean, like he heard the proclamation of the word.
Yeah,
that's the famous story of his heart was
Luther's
warmed.
Preface was his preface to Romans. Yeah. And that, if you want to understand Wesley as a person, that phrase, "my heart was strangely warmed," is a great one, because Wesley was the kind of guy who would think of a warm heart as strange.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
like he was a pretty.
That's a marital issues.
He was a passionate, like, for what he was doing.
Yeah.
But he was like, he didn't believe in fun. He didn't think anyone should ever laugh. Like he was, not a guy to learn from, but not necessarily a guy to fully emulate. And yet, by all accounts, a pretty terrible husband. Not one of those guys. I'm like, I would love to have his theological acumen. Yeah. I don't know that I'd want to do a road trip with him.
Yeah. I'm not going to ride on the horse with that guy. Yeah, fair enough. So now it's interesting. You were saying, you have a high view of the sacrament, but I think based on what you had just said there would be many who would see that as a bit of a red flag, in the sense of like, oh, you're demeaning the Eucharistic meal here. You're lowering that. Oh, you only have to do it quarterly and no one's checking. Like, talk to me about that. How is communion really viewed within the Wesleyan Church then? And I think I remember you preaching on this once before. It's, in a way, Wesleyans sort of allow for quite a lot of lateral movement in terms of like, how do you actually view the sacrament?
One of the things I do like about official Wesleyan theology is a lot of times there is a fair amount of wiggle room. Yeah. Like, for example, on the end times, we believe in the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. That's about it.
Take it, however you want to take that.
Pre, post, dispensation, like there's pay your money and take your chances. As long as you think he's coming back,
okay,
you're good. And so with communion is sort of a parallel with which is what we would tend to call it, communion of the Lord's Supper. We don't generally use the term Eucharist. I do, but as a tradition, we don't. I'm also a Wesleyan who's like partially Catholic, so that's kind of a whole other complication. But anyway, so you've got on one end, full-blown transubstantiation of the spectrum, right? And then you've got like your consubstantiation, and then you've got like your spiritual presence, and all the way to the other end of memorial meal. Like it's basically just an object lesson that draws our attention to the death and life of Jesus, death and resurrection of Jesus, but not in any meaningfully way different than singing the old rugged cross or whatever else, right? And so the official Wesleyan stance is that sacraments in general, but like both baptism and communion, but that communion is a means of grace. And there are lots of things we believe are means of grace. We believe praying is a means of grace. Bible study is a means of grace. Preaching is a means of grace. They are the ways that God, I think the technical language is, communicates grace to the soul. Not saving grace. Right. Not the idea that, you do enough of these things and you collect enough points and you get saved. But like when Paul says, I asked God to take this away from me, and he said, "My grace is sufficient for you," and meaning like my strengthening of you, that they bring greater strength, greater transformation. They aid in this process of sanctification. That there are ways that we meet with God, and we would say that going for a walk in the woods can be a means of grace. Sure. For some people, if you're wired that way, sitting and staring at a painting could be like God could choose to work, but that the sacraments are like guaranteed means of grace. Like they're things that we do receive grace. And so the nature of how Christ is present, or if he's present beyond via the grace that we receive, we don't really have a hard and fast on that. Right. I would say, it kind of rules out the memorial meal only because there's not that idea. It's definitely you're receiving grace. And you wouldn't find very many Wesleyans, I don't think, that would believe in full-blown transubstantiation, like with the whole philosophical underpinning of substance and accidents and all that kind of stuff. But I would say that I believe in the real presence. And, my prayer when I receive communion, because I don't fully understand how it works. Yeah. How he is present, how that works. But usually my prayer as I hold the elements in my hands is, Jesus, when you said, this is my body and this is my blood, whatever you meant, I accept. And so, I think there are a lot of people in the Wesleyan Church, I think, who do functionally view it as just a memorial meal, as a neat little thing we do, because it doesn't get preached on a lot, our theology there. And because we don't have, on that big question of like, what happens to the elements? What are they? Yeah. We don't have a hard and fast. It's not an easy one to preach our stance on, but you can talk about the whole means of grace idea. But so it's a pretty, I think Wesley as a high church Anglican probably had a lot higher view of the sacraments than the average Wesleyan. Yeah, right. And Wesley would have been all for baptizing babies, I'm sure. We sort of are. We do have a lane for that to honor our Methodist heritage. It's very uncommon.
So is that different across different Wesleyan churches or Methodist churches, or is it, because typically I see it as you dedicate. Yeah. Okay. And then it's still believers' baptism.
So again, wiggle room. So in the Wesleyan church, the simplified way to say it is we will either do dedication or baptism of infants. Okay. But it's a little disingenuous because it's not, it's right in the liturgy. I've baptized 2 babies in my ministry career. Okay. At Deepwater, actually. Oh, interesting. You might not have been there that Sunday.
I didn't know that.
It was early days. Twin brothers.
Okay.
But it's right in the liturgy, as I remember, that basically saying like, this is not meant to replace believers' baptism. Yeah. And so I would say the more honest way to say it is we do baby dedications, and we do baby dedications with water. Right. Right. Like do you want a dry dedication or a wet dedication? Okay. But typically Methodists, more like people, more general Methodists, more broadly, are much more okay with that because we come from that higher church tradition. But in this part of the world, we didn't even get into this, but so I mentioned the Wesleyan Church is made up of the merger of a bunch of other denominations, and I mentioned the 2 big ones. In Atlantic Canada and Maine, we weren't Methodist or Pilgrim Holiness. We were a group called the Reformed Baptist Alliance of Canada. And so from those Baptist roots in Atlantic Canada, baptism is 99.9% of the time adults.
Yeah, believers.
Believers, yeah. Like it might be an older child or a teenager, but yeah, credo baptism, if you want the technical term, and probably 97% of the time by immersion. Mm-hmm. I love immersion. I think immersion is the best way. Sure. Not the only valid way, but I think it's the best way to baptize someone. Just the symbolism, the death and the resurrection, all that's beautiful. But that's also not a hill we die on, though. I've sprinkled, misted, poured, and
brought the water gun out
and immersed. Yeah, I remember in one of the first churches I served in, there was a woman in the congregation who had a legit phobia of water. Okay, not just she was like nervous about getting in the pool or like, but like, could go to a shrink for it level. And so we baptized one day. We baptized like 7 people or whatever by immersion, and then poured over or sprinkled over her. Right, or when I was young, we baptized. Like my family baptized my great-grandmother. She had been a Christian for some time, but had never been baptized, and was like, I want to say 94, 95 at the time. We weren't taking her to a lake somewhere and throwing her in. So in her home, she stood in her bathtub, and my dad poured water over her head in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so, we've got some, usually on all that stuff, we've got kind of what's typical, and then what's the leeway. And so typically believers' baptism by immersion. Yeah. Sometimes other methods, and there is some provision for something that approximates an infant baptism, but it wouldn't be on the same level as what Catholics or
right. And so there's a lot of freedom within that. Like you're saying, there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of like, I like kind of what you said in the sense of like, whatever he meant by that, that's what we are here to accept and not reject.
Well, that's what I believe on communion. I couldn't promise you every other Wesleyan prays that prayer, but
within that, and it seems like the Holiness Movement, when it began, like you were talking about, it sort of started small group church settings in one sense where you wouldn't have a pastor over. So I'm interested in talking a little bit about, first of all, like the Episcopal order. Like that was a clear distinction I noticed coming into the Wesleyan church, being raised again with a father who's an Anglican cleric, that you have an episcopate. You have like the bishop tells him what he can do. That's not exactly how it works.
Yeah.
In the Wesleyan world.
So we have what is usually described as a modified congregational form of government.
Okay.
And so unlike kind of your classic Baptist where every church is autonomous, we don't have that at all. Mm-hmm. There is a fair amount of oversight and accountability and that kind of a thing. But there's sort of this balance of there's three levels to the church. There's the local church, the district, which would be the closest equivalent to that would be the diocese in a more Episcopal setting, and then the general conference, and then technically there's another thing called the international conference now. But so, King's Church, where we're sitting right here, is a local church. We're part of the Atlantic District, which is part of the North American General Conference. And so there is someone who is in charge, a single person who's in charge at each of those three levels, that answers to a board at each of those three levels that is elected by people, a large group of people from the level below. Okay. So your pastor is voted on and elected by the congregation, the members of the formal members of the congregation.
Yeah.
Your district superintendent, who's the leader at that district level, is ultimately elected by a group of delegates, both lay and clergy from all the churches on the district, come together and vote on who that person is. And then those district conferences every 4 years send a bunch of delegates, like there's a couple of thousand by the time we all get together, who elect the general superintendent and the general board. So the way I usually phrase it, when it's working well, and that's not always, but when it's working well, vision flows from the top down and accountability flows from the bottom up.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So there is someone who's empowered to actually lead.
Yeah.
It's not just every decision we make, we got to get 1 million people in a room and vote. But there is accountability when it comes to moral issues, theological issues, and even when it comes to just how well you're doing. Mm-hmm. Like there's someone who reviews that kind of a thing. And that is a represented from the people they serve. You're accountable to the people you serve.
Okay.
And so, that's kind of our structure. So it's not a full on, like it's, I think day to day, it functions a little more episcopally.
Okay.
A little more like it's led by a person, who answers to a person above, but also is held accountable to those below. So, there's a certain amount of accountability that a church has to a district, and a district has accountability to a general conference. The pastor has some accountability to a district superintendent has accountability to a general superintendent, but it's not one of those things where there's a small group of people at the top who pick their representatives all the way downstream.
You're right.
It's kind of a blend. Again, I think in general it's a pretty good system. Although I always come to that. What is it? Churchill, his whole democracy is the worst form of government except every other one we've tried. Like it's not without its issues and challenges.
Yeah.
But it seems to work. Yeah.
When it functions well.
Seems to work when it functions well.
So I'd say this is really good in terms of giving us an overview of kind of what Wesleyan theology looks like, who John Wesley was, how did this all get started, and where are our points of emphasis. I'm curious where you see the future of the Wesleyan Church, or what do you think it really brings to the table this day and age? Like we are in a cultural moment. You can say there's nothing new under the sun, but I think it's a unique time for whatever reasons. We face a lot of things. What is the real strength of Wesleyanism in that context? What do you think your denomination is bringing to the worldwide church? What do you think it's bringing to the table?
Yeah, I have a pretty, I got to answer this two ways. I have a pretty low view of denominations generally. I don't mean they're bad. I just don't think they're that big a deal.
Yeah, I feel that way.
I kind of like they're the team I play on.
Sure.
Right. And so, there's probably 5 or 6 other denominations I could be a part of without even having to read what their official statement of faith is, because it's just so close to mine, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Like it wouldn't even, and then there's probably a bunch of, dozens of others that I'd have to take a quick look, but yeah, I can operate in this system,
sure.
right? And so I don't have a real like the Wesleyan church is this great, we're accomplishing some uniquely great thing. But I would say kind of Wesleyan Methodism, historical Methodism, like a lot of Methodist denominations have become super liberal and flighty and somewhere between heretical and apostate or whatever else, right? But to put it gently. But I would say that idea of being optimistic about the possibilities of grace. We live in a world right now where people, I think, maybe more than ever in my lifetime, and maybe more than, in a long time, generations, are deeply aware of how broken they are. Almost in some ways like people's brokenness has become their identity. Like, I am my diagnosis, or I am my condition, or I am my whatever, right? But there is an awareness of that. I think a growing awareness of personal brokenness and of systemic brokenness. And the Wesleyan movement has long been a champion of the idea that the good news of Jesus Christ and what he's done for us on the cross and the grace he extends to us can transform an individual and can transform a society, a culture, a family, a town, whatever. Like those stories you hear of, revivals where all the bars go out of business because that's in our history and our heritage. Those types of moments, those types of movements. And so I think, sort of to circle back to something we talked about earlier, that does this work? Like, does this change my life?
Yeah.
I think some of the things that the Wesleyan Church and that Methodism in general tends to emphasize offer people some hope for that, as opposed to just, hey, like you're kind of and I don't want to overly stereotype some of the other theological schools, but you're a miserable wretch, but you could be a miserable wretch whose name's in the book of life, right? Or like,
right.
Your life is horrible and you're terrible and you're racked by these sins that you can't seem to shake and you can't get victory over. But if you can just tough that out for another 30 or 40 years, then you'll die. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that idea that the kingdom of heaven starts here. Like that you can begin to live in a kingdom reality now, that the curse is broken, not will be broken. And that, again, I don't get too hung up on this idea of, sinless perfection, but that you don't like sinning every day in thought, word, and deed as a willful transgression of a known law of God does not have to be the norm for you.
Right.
If I've got a horrible temper and I just lose it, like, God can fix that. My dad always had this line I always loved. He'd be talking, never by name, but my dad was a pastor, and every now and again, when I got older, he'd share about some frustrating person that he had to interact with or whatever, just because he knew I was going into ministry and he wanted to help me. And he would say, like, somebody just being an absolute jerk, someone doing the most like just wretched stuff. And my dad believed and experienced and models this idea so clearly of what God can do in your life. Like, he's the kindest, gentlest man I know, strongest shepherd I think I've ever met. Just cannot stop loving people even in his older years. And the reason he went to Bible college in the first place, not because he believed in Jesus, but because he was worried one of these days he was going to kill somebody. Because he said, I remember, never forget the day he said, I was worried one of these days I wasn't going to stop beating someone's head off the curb in time.
Wow.
Like, he used to just get drunk and beat the crap out of people just for fun, like just this angry, vicious. And when he told me that, I was like, that is not the guy I grew up with, right? Yeah. Jesus made this guy a different guy. He really is he's not just in a new category, he's a new creation,
he's a
right?
new creation, yeah.
And so, I think my dad would always say sometimes when he's encountering someone who was being very carnal, as we'd say, goes, it's nothing a good dose of sanctification wouldn't fix, and just for people to know, like there's God's power doesn't just transfer you from a category to another.
Yeah.
That you're not just set free from the guilt of sin, but you can actually be set free from the power of sin.
Yeah.
That this idea of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is not just a thing for you to put on the wall and then think about how you fail at it every day, that he actually wants to help you grow more into that.
Right.
And I do think sometimes in the past, Wesleyans have gotten a little too hung up on mapping out an exact, here's what that process is going to look like for everybody.
Right.
And we emphasize this crisis of entire sanctification. That's this moment where that happens. And I remember talking to an old seasoned Wesleyan pastor named Orville Butcher. And I said, Pastor Butcher, I don't know about this crisis thing. He said, what do you mean? I said, I feel like my whole spiritual life is just one crisis after another,
Yeah.
I got to surrender this, got to surrender that, and he said, yeah, that's normal. And he said, and at some point you'll get to the last one, like the last area you're holding back, or the last thing that you're, there's this old classic illustration about your life being like a house, right? And you let Jesus in the front door, and he, it's kind of that idea of like, eventually you'll get to whatever that last closet or cubby hole was.
Yeah.
And I think if you fixate on getting to the last thing, you actually short circuit the process.
Yeah.
And I think it's just keep saying yes.
Keep saying yes.
Keep submitting and keep believing. I think a big part of the reason, back to your original question here, one of the big things that Wesleyan theology brings to the table is, again, just a faith for what God can do. And for us not to settle for defeated, carnal, self-centered lives because we're not in glory yet.
Yeah.
But to just keep cooperating with the work of the Holy Spirit and realize there's further, always further to go, not just in the sense of you're not there yet, but you actually can continue to move closer to that, right? Like I think a lot of people, there's further to go, but they're not actually going.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's like I've camped out at whatever 20% of holiness because I don't think I'll reach 100% in this life, right?
Yeah.
Well, how would you even define that? But to just go, yeah, God can do amazing things in your life. He really can transform people. And I think we live in a world right now where people are aware of their brokenness and need that message of hope.
Great conversation, AJ.
Thanks,
Thank
man. It
you
was
for
fun.
being part of this episode of Denominations in Conversation. So
Happy to be here.
yeah, thanks very much. And on behalf of Apologetics Canada, we always end by saying our little phrase here that we abide by: love God, love people. That's what it's all about. Thanks.
It's the AC Podcast.